Good morning and afternoon, everybody. This is Nick Astor, founder and publisher of TriplePundit.com. Welcome to another Google Hangout. We are really excited to be working with Siemens again this month on a hangout on the topic of creating resilient cities. I'm excited to be joined by Michael Stevens with Siemens. He's specifically with the Siemens Center for Competent Cities. I'll give him a chance to explain exactly what that means. We're also joined by Stephen Cook. He is the Associate Director of Energy and Climate Change Consulting for Arup, and I'll also give you a chance to tell us a little bit about what that is. We're going to aim to keep today's chat to about 30 minutes, so we'll be going through things relatively quickly, but if we get carried away, bear with us. We'll keep it rolling as long as these gentlemen are willing to hang out and talk to us. If you are missing this chat, or if you have colleagues that are not here now, don't worry, this will all be archived on our YouTube channel for you to watch later on as well. Michael, would you mind just telling us a little bit about who you are and what the Center for Competent Cities is all about at Siemens?
Hi everyone, my name is Michael Stevens and I work for Siemens, and maybe just for those of you who don't know what Siemens is, it's a global company that does a lot of infrastructure and technology solutions, especially in the space of transportation, energy, transmission, generation, distribution, and water management and building technologies. Actually, it's not competent cities, it's Center of Competence Cities. But so what we do here is we aim to make cities competent. We are a group of about 20 urban planners, urban economists, and technology specialists, and we work with cities and with global organizations, and we try to identify how infrastructure assets interact with cities and what benefits to bring to cities, not just in regards to efficiency and energy, but also what co-benefits it would bring. So what are the economic benefits of investing in good transportation solutions, etc. And I have been working in the space of urban resilience for the last couple of years together with Stephen Cook, who's sitting right next to me. I think that's it.
Stephen?
That's great. So, hello, I'm Stephen Cook. As Nick said, I'm an Associate Director at Arup, which is a global firm of designers, planners, and consultants of all types, mostly focused on the built environment, but we cover really a wide variety of areas of consultancy. And my team here in London is really focused on energy and climate change, and primarily focused on cities. So we cover quite a range in our team of engineers doing detailed feasibility and design kind of projects on decentralized energy and other projects like that. But we also work with cities at the more strategic level on issues of energy and resilience, which, as Michael says, is a main area that we've been collaborating over the last couple of years.
Great. Okay, so let's just get into it. We're talking about cities. This is a big deal. We have a rapidly urbanizing world. Some years ago, we passed that statistic where more than 50% of the Earth's population is now in an urban area, and we expect that trend to continue. Tell me a little bit about the kinds of challenges that creates, specifically for people and the businesses and everything else that operates inside of a city with regards to climate change, climate risk.
Sure.
Either you can both answer the question, whatever you guys like.
You see all around the world in those cities that are rapidly developing. At the human scale, obviously with the explosive growth of unplanned settlements of slum areas, you do have tremendous poverty and in those areas. People are not provided with the urban services they need, and so for a city to accommodate that population growth and to meet the needs of those cities, of all those citizens, both in the formal and planned areas and in the wider unplanned areas, there's really a huge challenge on providing the infrastructure and the services and growing those systems, at the pace of the city's growth. And so, when you can't keep pace with that demand, then inevitably those systems will become overloaded, and so each time there's a shock event, whether it's a weather event or something else, civil unrest or an economic kind of crisis, the systems that underpin the city are less well able to support people's responses, and so each impact is in some way multiplied by the stress and strain on those infrastructure systems. I think that's really the key area, and that's something that for cities, over the long term, when it recurs again and again, then that can be a real kind of long-term competitiveness issue with cities that, businesses won't move there if they see the city as just not able to cope with basic requirements. Then if you can't do business there, then that becomes a kind of compounding risk for cities in the longer term.
I mean, also to be very concrete, for instance, here in London, where we're sitting today, Steve and I mean, the city is growing with more than 100,000 people per year. And that, of course, puts enormous stress on the housing stock, the schools, all the social infrastructure, and also the transportation infrastructure. If you take the tube around in London, you can barely squeeze an extra person in the morning. So, and at the same time, you have a lot of infrastructure that sort of dates back 150 years. So you have sort of aging infrastructure, you have stress by increased users, you have to provide more services, and all these things, they sort of, the tension, they apply a certain tension at the city. So that's for an existing city like London, but then you have all these new cities that are growing even faster than 100,000 per year. You have like Ho Chi Minh City, which I guess is 200,000 or 300,000 people per year, and that's very much into informal settlements. And for there, they don't have the adequate infrastructure at all, and it's very difficult to retrofit a city so it's a good place to live, and you can provide decent connectivity, decent power supply, and all these kind of things. So you have sort of many urbanizations is posing many different types of challenges of different cities around the world, I would say, and especially in the fast-growing cities now, it's very much about getting it right at the moment, because once they make decisions of investments in infrastructure and transportation systems, energy systems, they're locked into a certain development pattern for the next 30 years. So it's really important that the decisions they make today, that has consequence maybe 100 years in the future. So it's if you want to have cities that are resilient, you really have to start thinking about it now, and have to make decisions on that.
Got it.
I think just one other comment really on that. I think, in a sense, what's underlying some of those issues, or many of those issues, is this sense of cities being incredibly complex places, and current itself. And so you have a storm in it, and it causes a transport system to fail, but then it's businesses that can't operate, and then it's we saw in I think it was Bangkok a few years ago, some major floods there that then led to wider impacts in the supply chain of semiconductors because of the flooding in Bangkok. And so among those challenges is in some way for cities and city managers and leaders to find a way to understand the complexity at least well enough so that they can plan and think through responses for how to respond with events as they occur, but also how to plan longer term to make their cities more able to cope with those events as they occur.
Got it. Well, that's good. So you talked a little bit about the long-term trends that might be occurring here vis-a-vis climate change, and then you also talked a little bit about more specific extreme weather events. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of the difference in terms of being able to prepare for those one-off extreme weather events, and whether that's something that's a little bit different from the long-term, planning for a long-term trend in general?
I mean, I think you can normally would divide it into sort of shocks and long-term slow onset stresses. So the shocks would be a hurricane or extreme rainfall or an earthquake or whatever it could be. That would be sort of a shock. And then you have sort of more long-term stresses, which is used the sea level rise, for instance, and the increased heat you have in cities, especially in urban heat islands. And of course, it means you have many different sort of considerations to take into place as the risk at a city, as you said, is multifaceted, and the risks are also multifaceted. They have the ones that are very, how do they respond to some concrete event now that shuts down different parts of the system infrastructure, that shuts down a hospital, or shuts down the transportation system? How does it sort of get back and online again very quickly, the city? How does it respond very quickly? But then you have the longer term events that sort of, and that's really where you have to think about the planning. I mean, where do you place your infrastructure assets? Do you want them right next to the water? Do you want to build a power station next to the water? Do you want a big centralized power station at all? But it's really sort of these kind of different, they're very different, but they're interlinked, of course, these two types of stresses that cities are facing.
I think I'd add, in some ways, kind of what Michael was beginning to say, that I think often the responses that you need in a city are going to be quite similar potentially. I mean, there's, as Michael said, there's some specific planning that one needs to do around specific events and how you respond immediately to that. But for all cities, having a way to capture data, to understand and measure what's happening, what has happened in the past and what is happening today in real time, is sort of critical for both of those things. For the shock events to be able to understand and very quickly, where things are breaking down, where those impacts are. But for the stresses, to be able to see that in a bit more real time as well, allows you to have much better interpretation of the issue and then much better sort of planning of solutions. So I think for cities that are contemplating, or businesses indeed, or other organizations that are contemplating how do we begin, it certainly isn't an either or. It's it's understanding your shocks, but also understanding your stresses and finding a kind of holistic approach that allows you to be resilient to specific things that are coming, but also to have what you might say a general resilience, a capacity to cope with the unknown unknowns, if you like, because those will surely come.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just to very, very briefly add on, I mean, you mentioned now the competent cities, and I think that just to stay on that sort of conversation, I think knowing your short-term and long-term vulnerabilities is, of course, extremely important for a city, and those are the short-term and long-terms, and once you know them, that enables you to act on them and to plan towards them in every way. And I think that's really one of the key areas. What is going to happen in the future, both long-term and short-term, and how do you sort of react to that? How do you prepare yourself for that?
To take I'd love to get into some specific examples, and we'll get down to that. But New York, for example, we had this big storm, Sandy, basically knocked out urban services for the city. I mean, it practically shut down the city. Tell me a little bit about, in light of that particular example, some of the things that you were mentioning, we were talking about. It's not just about new infrastructure, there's also an upgrading opportunity for infrastructure. Can you tell us a little bit about that and sort of how that takes place and where those opportunities are for cities?
Sure. New York, as you mentioned, that was really an area for us in the previous report that we produced. Michael's holding up a copy there, which we called the Toolkit for Resilient Cities, and that was a study where we at Arup with Siemens and the Regional Plan Association, which covers the sort of New York metropolitan area, we worked together to understand what resilience is and how it's understood in an urban context, and particularly how the principles of resilience and the characteristics of resilience can be applied to infrastructure planning and design, and so those themes that you see often in the resilience literature around redundancy and flexibility and responsiveness, those are things which we then looked at. Well, okay, how are designers and companies like Siemens, how are they helping to make those infrastructure systems have those characteristics? And a lot of what we were seeing is the way IT systems and data and communications and monitoring systems, the sort of IT infrastructure overlay, if you can call it, the software overlay on these hard infrastructure systems, really had quite a lot of power to enhance the flexibility those systems, their robustness, and also to help the managers and operators make decisions in real time to help plan for events and also respond to events as they unfold. So that was a key area of focus, as I said, and as you see, if you look in the report toward the back, we've sort of reported on a case study where we've investigated, well, if you invested in the electricity grid in just a repair or even in enhancing the defenses, you essentially get a profile of continuing expenditure just to kind of get you back to where you are with no real benefit. If you instead invest in the smart grid kind of technology and the smart systems, the IT systems overlay onto that electricity grid, you get considerable extra benefits in terms of the kind of resilience performance, but also in other areas like energy efficiency and improved environmental impacts, reduced environmental impacts. So we saw a great kind of synergistic sort of win-win set of benefits between your objectives about making the system perform better under stress, but also perform better day to day in terms of the overall efficiency of the system.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that, but I mean, basically, it was, as you said, we looked in how you have New York has these existing electricity distribution assets. So how can we make that system better prepared for an event like Sandy? So we looked into, okay, we will make some substations waterproof. We will underground some overhead lines. We would look into automated demand response solutions, so you could sort of ensure that power was directed towards critical facilities like hospitals, etc. We looked into solutions that would, or microgrids that could sort of, small solutions that are small sort of power generations that are self-sufficient, small communities actually, where they generate their own power and they can sort of, so they could operate offline the main grid. And we looked into if you implemented all this in New York, what would the benefits be, both in regards to resilience, how would it enable the city to sort of keep functioning, at least keep the critical functions up and running, and what would all the co-benefits be? Because I think that's a very big aspect of this retrofitting discussion, that there's a lot of co-benefits, and as Stephen said, it's enabled by IT technology. Mm-hmm. And it was also sort of the point of the report was also to stimulate the discussion a little bit about, you can do this, and there's also some economic benefits connected to it. So basically we came up with 3 different scenarios. If New York did nothing based on its current climate forecast, where every 3 years something similar to like Sandy would take place, that would cost the city $3 billion. I think, I'm not sure, but I think so. Correct me if I'm wrong. But if they over 20 years, and if they invested in basic protection measures of the critical infrastructure, that would sort of reduce the loss to $1 billion. But if they invested in the smart grid, there would be sort of a net benefit, essentially, of close to, over 3 years. These are rough assumptions, but something close to $3 billion. So there is a case for investing in these types of infrastructure, and it's not only driven by increased resilience.
Interesting. I'm curious to hear, you've outlined a whole host of challenges here, and it seems like a certain number of these are going to come down to the city government and the city officials who are basically trying to run the city. And I'm curious if you could sort of break down these challenges and tell us a little bit about what is specifically affecting city government. I'm sure that funding is a big one of them, and I know that we talked about that a little bit in the last hangout that we did with some of you guys. But maybe you could just break down a little bit more, the challenges specifically for city government, and then after that we'll go into some specific examples.
Yeah, I'll have a go. I mean, the challenge of things like resilience or sort of adaptation measures is that it's not very sexy necessarily to invest a lot of money in things that may or may not happen in how you predict it. There is a certain uncertainty. I mean, there is an increased frequency of extreme events, so it's the probability that something will happen is very large, but luckily there's no guarantee that it will happen within sort of the electoral cycle that you have at local government, for example. So these protective measures that you need to invest in to a certain extent, some of them, they're huge cost. I mean, if we look in London, they built the Thames Barrier, which was a massive. I wish I had a picture of it somewhere I can see it. This is a massive piece of infrastructure that basically, right around the corner, it can close the Thames, which is a big river that runs into London. And I think they built it in the 80s. It was a response to a flood that happened in 1953, I think.
Yeah.
And this big piece of infrastructure was a massive investment. However, it does protect the city. It protected it since then. There hasn't been a flood since then. And of course, I mean, that was a big, this was done as a response to an extreme event that took place. So, you know, there was a catalyst. There was an event that sort of catalyzed action. In the same way you also saw that Sandy in New York City also had spurned a lot of action from the Bloomberg administration as it was back then. So I think it's very difficult for a city that, for instance, I just had a conversation with someone from Hong Kong, and we were talking about the resilience, and I said, okay, when was your last sort of major natural disaster? And they said, well, sometimes in the 60s or 70s. And then I said, okay, so, you know, what is the incentive to do these kind of investments? And it was very much in, okay, there we go, the Thames barrier. I don't know if you can see the picture, the audience, but it's a huge piece. It's very nice on a beautiful day. But of course, if you have a sort of collective history of extreme events happening, that is, of course, a catalyst for investments or for actions. But if there's nothing taking place, it's not a very attractive thing to invest in and increase the resilience. I think that's one of the challenges.
I think implied in that really is it would be hard to underestimate the importance of leadership in cities. That you need somebody or a lot of somebodies who can, you know, in a sense, use those events as a real catalyst for action, or, you know, even better, to identify a risk or a situation that you see, you know, in the city today that needs to be addressed, and they can articulate that in a way that gets the attention of you know, of the other decision makers, the other stakeholders across the city, but, you know, often the citizens. I mean, you know, you're talking to the taxpayers and asking them for, you know, an additional levy to pay for infrastructure investment. You know, you've got to get the message right, and leadership is critical to that. Mm-hmm. I mean, a good example is New Orleans, which, you know, sort of as an American, you know, we all know and saw the pictures of what happened after Katrina. But, you know, what I was in New Orleans, and as part of a study we've been carrying out with the Rockefeller Foundation on resilience. I was there last year interviewing people from across the city government and the private sector and communities, and, you know, what I saw was particularly within the city government, a kind of almost unity of expression around the mission that they're on, and that was very focused on, you know, on issues of resilience, and for them, you know, it's absolutely about the infrastructure and about, you know, getting a better relationship with water that they have, but it's also an awful lot about the community. And, you know, I spoke to the director of public health, and for her, you know, it was about getting much better public health provision, and so all of those pieces were coming together. And I think, you know, that was coming from the mayor, but then it you know, flowed through. So I think seeing the power of leadership kind of get the conversation started and get the vocabulary there, you see that rippling out across the community, where people begin to recognize that these things are important and begin to talk about, well, how do we make it happen, as opposed to it's too much or it's too far in the future, because then, you know, that kind of attitude just will get you to the next disaster.
Yeah, it seems like that's one of the tragic running themes, is that often it takes one of these big disasters to wake people up to make the investment. And really, to me, one of the fundamental questions here when we're talking about resilient cities is, you know, trying to explain to people that these types of things are unfortunately going to be more and more likely in the future. And by investing slow and steady now, we're going to be preventing, you know, what's ultimately going to be a tragedy or certainly a great deal of additional expense down the line after the next unfortunate event occurs. Would you concur? Is that sort of a tragedy of human nature, or is that something that we can definitely try to prevent through your work and through this conversation at large?
I mean, I don't know if our work necessarily can prevent it, but at least it tries to sort of highlight that there's other benefits that should be taken into consideration when you consider these types of investments. So it should not necessarily only be on, you should not only base your decision on how your city can react to climate change risk, but there's other benefits you should take into the equation before you make your decision. And if you take all of these co-benefits as efficiency benefits, very often if you take it into consideration, you actually have a positive economic case. And of course, then there's all these other issues that many cities now, especially in the US, cities are competing against each other. They want to create good places to live. You want to attract people, you want to attract businesses there. And to do that, you need to have a well-functioning city. You need to have urban services that are delivered and are secure. Like you need to have water, you need to have power. And all these things, this competition also potentially has a positive element that you want to invest in your city, that you should invest, and you want to ensure that people are not at risk. Businesses are not at risk. They won't be wiped out if something happens, like Sandy. One thing I just wanted to get back to, Nick, was this sort of, the challenges. And you, of course, have this sort of challenges of also, you have political cycles. You have, you're elected a mayor for 5 years, and of course, that's one of the main challenges. Why would you invest something in this, this short period if there's no result of it? You don't know if you invest a lot of money in a big piece of infrastructure or smaller sort of adaptation of green area. You don't know if you would be there to get the credit for it. Essentially, you're not sure you will get the credit for it, and that's of course a challenge. But I think the leadership issue that you mentioned, that we see some cities, and also New Orleans has a fantastic plan. If you can sort of integrate sort of your adaptation work, resilience work, into long-term plans that are accepted. And I'm sure that no city official in New Orleans would say it's not important how we address the water issue of our cities now after Katrina. And you have long-term plans that can enable, long-term visions, long-term plans for how your city should develop, both the economic growth, but also how, the spatial growth, etc. I think that's a good way to sort of get people on board and sort of engage with your community, to get them to sort of course, engage with different stakeholders, how you want your plan to develop. But I think these plans are great examples of how you can sort of, or are the best examples of how you can engage people and sort of find funding for the long term.
I think just one last point on that, really. New York is a great example of a city that actually, they had been planning for a Sandy for quite some time, and clearly, the storm was bigger than quite what they anticipated or quite what the systems were able to cope with on the night. But the way that the city responded, and the speed with which you saw plans coming out afterwards for what they want to do, that really tells you that there had been quite a lot of thinking going on in the background. And Cynthia Rosenzweig, Michael mentioned before, I heard her speak a couple of years ago, and not long after, and she said, yeah, we were working on this. It was moving along, but after Sandy, the pace really accelerated. But they were able to accelerate from a position of already moving in some way on this, and I think that that was key. So as Michael says, nothing we can do will kind of magically make cities overcome that human nature to put it off until it's too late. But clearly there's lots of great examples around the world of cities that that both didn't plan, but also some great examples of cities that did plan. And so even if they were impacted less, and they were able to recover and respond and move to the next level of being even better prepared for the next event.
Good stuff, and that's going to be the fun part of the conversation. We've got a few minutes left, and I'd really love to hear a few more of those examples that you mentioned. Basically, who are the cities that are doing it right? And I'd just like to, a lot of this is in the toolkit that you mentioned earlier, Michael, and I understand there's going to be a new one coming out soon, which we'd love to hear about as well. And for those of you who are interested in it, it's right there on Siemens' website. It's also links to above this chat. If you can't find it, leave a comment, and I'll point you to it. But please tell us who's doing it right. Give us some of the other good examples out there.
One example that I have to mention, which was a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago actually, Siemens hosted together with C40, which is a network of mega cities around the world focused on sustainability issues. They hosted the City Climate Leadership Awards, and there was a category for adaptations and resilience, and Melbourne won there. And so I have to honor Melbourne. I think they do a great job. They have this long-term plan, Melbourne. The main challenge Melbourne's facing is that it's getting hotter and hotter down there, and of course, this increased heat is dangerous for people and pets and everything, so the whole environment. And also, as there's coming less and less water there, the green areas are disappearing. There's droughts. So they have developed a long-term strategy. I'm trying to find the name of it. Landscape Climate Adaptation Program, where they look into reducing the urban heat islands around the city. They have employed sort of clever monitoring tools so you can report on how hot different areas of the cities are. They're planting trees all over the place, and they have a long-term vision for how they want to reduce the average temperature in the city by 4 degrees over the next 20 years, I think it is. So it's quite ambitious, and they're doing a great job, of course. But there's plenty of cities that are actually doing. I mean, you don't want to, that's just meant many cities are doing a good job. But I mean, there's a couple others that I think you should mention. I mean, London, the Thames Barrier is also doing quite a lot. They were the first very big city that developed a adaptation strategy for the city. I'm Danish, so and from Copenhagen, so I'll also mention Copenhagen, and again there, like in New York, it was already happening there, but there was an event that catalyzed action. So they made a climate change adaptation plan after extreme rainfall in 2011. And what was very interesting, they put it together very fast, and it was, it went through the city council with no problem. Everyone voted for it. They did it 2 months after they presented it, and then they went into a long stakeholder engagement process with the citizens. You want green infrastructure, you want gray infrastructure, different solutions. They did rendering of city images, so they engaged with the local citizens. We're going to have more of these extreme rainfall events. This is how we have these different options. It's going to cost you something. There's different options of how we can address it. We can sort of plant parks, water reservoirs, or we can sort of bigger tunnels, etc. And then they try to sort of engage with citizens. How would these things affect the city? Because they, of course, affect the cities in many ways, the way that the connectivity works today. But they had a very, very long process of engaging with the stakeholders, and I also find that as a great example. But there's many cities around the world, I think, that are doing a good job.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning, it's not just the city governments where these things are happening. So, you see a lot of good examples of utilities and infrastructure operators who get it as well. And of course, it's their daily business, but in some way it still needs the leadership and the attitude in there. But for instance, some of my transport colleagues here in the UK have been working with the national railway operator on a program called TRACA, which has been focused on measuring and monitoring climate and extreme weather risks and planning for those across the whole of the railway network. And that's going to be an integral part of every city in the UK being able to be better able to keep moving in the face of those events. So I think that's another area where there's some good practice emerging as well.
I mean, you also mentioned the work we're doing on Ho Chi Minh City, and I think I would just like to mention it as well. No, I mean, basically we as Stephen, when we talked about this toolkit for resilient cities in this New York case study, where we looked into the electricity distribution grid and how you could make that more what new technology and IT technology could do to it. We wanted to see could you actually replicate this kind of model? Could you identify co-benefits that would make an economic case for these type of investments? So we decided to sort of look at a city that was challenged in many ways, but also especially by climate change, in regards to sort of increased flood risk of the city and a fast-growing city. So there's a lot of pressure. So Ho Chi Minh City, which is about the greater metropolitan area, has 10 million people. It's growing with 200,000 or 300,000 people per year. We want to see could you sort of take the same model? Could you establish the same benefits there? But instead of looking at the electricity grid, we decided to look at the transportation network and see how we could make that more resilient. We're still working on it, and of course it has had different challenges. But I mean, essentially, we could find a scenario. We could identify technologies that would enable the existing road network to be able to respond, or at least make people respond who are using the road network better to extreme flooding, etc. And we also looked into, because one of the challenges which Siemens has, an additional challenge, is how do you get funding for these kind of things. So we also wanted to look into what kind of elements could help fund these investments in infrastructure that would make the city more efficient on a day-to-day basis, but also make it more resilient when a climate change shock took place. And we also, again, I mean, we work for an engineering company. I work also for engineering manufacturing company. So we look into technology solutions, and we identified different ways that the technology could actually help capture revenue streams that would more than pay for these investments in solutions that would make the road network more efficient. I mean, I think we're going to launch it in a month's time, and I'll be very happy to give you a better address where you can find it, or anyone who's interested can find it. But I think, you know, we're quite happy with it, but we're still on our way.
Great. Gentlemen, thanks so much. I promised everyone I'd keep this to about 30 minutes, so I want to honor that and thank both of you very much for taking some time out of your afternoon to discuss this issue with us. We'll be sharing all of those resources that you mentioned, Michael. A lot of them are already linked to on our site as well as on yours, and we will continue to cover this subject in the future, and we look forward to hopefully chatting with you another time.
Yes, likewise. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.